The storm hit the mountain just after 11 at night, and Jake Morrison sat in his cabin watching the rain hammer against the windows like angry fists, trying to break through the glass and get inside where it was warm and dry he had been living. Alone in this place for 3 years now after leaving the army and deciding he needed peace and quiet away from people and cities and all the noise that came with both of them, and most nights he enjoyed the solitude, but tonight something felt different in the air, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something big to happen. Jake stood up from his chair and walked to the kitchen to make coffee. Because sleep seemed impossible tonight, and as the water began to boil, he heard something that made his blood run cold, because even through the howling wind and crashing thunder, he could hear it. Clearly someone was knocking on his door, not just knocking but pounding desperately, like their life depended on getting inside right now. And Jake grabbed the hunting rifle he kept by the door, because nobody came up this mountain road at midnight during a storm unless something was very wrong here. Pulled the door open, and the wind nearly ripped it from his hands, and standing there in the rain was a woman unlike anyone he had ever seen before, because her hair was silver like moonlight and hung down past her shoulders dripping wet, and her eyes were violet and seemed to glow faintly in the darkness. But what made Jake freeze was the pointed ears rising from her hair and the strange armor she wore that looked like it was made from metal that shifted colors in the lightning flashes, and the blood that covered her body from wounds he could see through tears in that armor. She looked up at him with those impossible eyes, and her lips moved, and he barely heard her voice over the storm as she said, "May I stay here tonight, human?" And then she fell forward, and Jake dropped his rifle to catch her before she hit the wooden porch. She was lighter than he expected, and as he lifted her, he saw something massive move in the shadows beyond his porch, and 2 huge amber eyes opened in the darkness and stared at him with an intelligence that was definitely not human or animal. The creature stepped forward into the light spilling from his doorway, and Jake nearly dropped the woman because it was a dragon or something, so close to a dragon that the difference did not matter at all. It had scales the color of burning coals and dull wings folded against its body, and it was bleeding too from deep cuts along its neck and shoulder, and it made a sound that was part growl and part whimper as it looked at the woman in Jake arms. The dragon was young, he realized, and no bigger than a horse, but its teeth were still the size of knives, and Jake knew it could kill him in a heartbeat if it wanted to, but instead it just watched him with those glowing eyes, waiting to see what he would do. Jake made a decision that would change his entire life and probably put him in danger he could not even imagine yet, but he could not leave them out here to die in the storm. So he carried the woman inside and called to the dragon, and after a moment of hesitation, followed him through the door that was barely wide enough for its body. He laid the woman on his couch, and the dragon curled up on the floor beside her, never taking its eyes off Jake as he grabbed his old field medic kit from the closet, because the army had taught him how to patch up wounds even if he never expected to use those skills on an alien. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness as he cleaned and bandaged her injuries, and sometimes she would mumble words in a language he did not understand. In other times she spoke in perfect English, but nothing she said made complete sense. She talked about ships falling from the sky and enemies called devourers who ate worlds and consumed everything living on them, and she said Earth was next on their list, and humanity did not even know the danger coming for them. Jake thought maybe she was delirious from blood loss and pain, but the dragon was real, and so were her pointed ears and that strange armor, and he had learned in the army that sometimes the impossible was just something you had not seen yet. He moved to the dragon next and tensed when he approached, but the woman reached out with one hand and touched its scaled snout and whispered something, and the dragon relaxed and let Jake examine its wounds. The cuts were deep but already healing faster than should be possible, and Jake could see the flesh knitting back together as he watched, and he wondered what kind of biology could repair itself that quickly. As dawn began to break outside, the storm finally passed, and weak sunlight came through the windows, and the woman opened her eyes fully for the first time and looked directly at Jake with a clarity that had been missing before. Her name was Lyria, she told him, and she was a princess of a race called the Starbound Elves, and they had been fighting a war across the galaxy for thousands of years against an enemy that destroyed everything it touched. The dragon was called Ember and was her bonded companion. Since birth, and they had been shot down over Earth 3 days ago, while trying to escape from Devourer scouts who were hunting them. Lyria had crashed in the mountains and been hiding in caves and forests trying to heal while avoiding the enemy. Forces searching for her, and she had chosen his cabin last night because she could sense something in him that was different from other humans. She said he had the spirit of a warrior, even though he was trying to hide from that part of himself. And she needed a warrior now, because the Devourers had found her trail, and they would be coming soon, and when they came, they would kill everyone. Nearby to make sure she did not escape again, Jake listened to all of this, and part of him wanted to think she was crazy, but Ember was lying right there on his floor, breathing smoke from her nostrils, and Lyria had technology and weapons that were centuries beyond anything humans had built. He asked her why she came to Earth and why the Devourers wanted this planet, and Lyria looked sad as she explained that Earth was in a perfect position between two major Devourer territories, and they planned to turn it into a staging ground for their next conquest. But more than that, she said humans had something special that most other species did not have, and when he asked what that was, she touched his forehead with one finger, and he felt something surge through his mind like electricity. She called it resonance and said it was a psychic energy that let the Starborn bond with dragons and power their weapons, and most humans should not have it because they were too young as a species, but somehow it did have it buried deep inside, waiting to wake up. Jake pulled away from her touch, breathing hard because he had felt something in that moment like a door opening in his mind to rooms he never knew existed, and it terrified him and thrilled him at the same time. Illyria told him the Devourers would come within days, and she was still too weak to fight them alone, and Ember needed more time to heal fully, and she was asking him to help her, not because she had any right to, but because billions of humans would die if the Devourers succeeded in their plan. Jake walked to his window and looked out at the mountain forest stretching away in every direction, and thought about the quiet life he had built here away from violence and war and duty. Then he thought about cities full of people who had no idea what was coming for them, and he thought about the woman on his couch who had knocked on his door at midnight, asking for shelter, and he knew he could not turn away now, even if he wanted to. He turned back to Lyria and told her he would help her, and she smiled for the first time since arriving, and it transformed her face from beautiful to radiant, and Ember made a pleased rumbling sound deep in her chest. Jake Morrison had opened his door to a stranger in a storm, and that simple act of kindness had pulled him into a war between worlds, and his quiet life was over forever. But as he looked at Lyria and Ember, he realized maybe that was exactly what he needed, even if he had not known it until now. The next 3 days passed in a blur of training and learning and preparing for a fight Jake barely understood but knew was coming whether he was ready or not. Lyria recovered her strength hour by hour, and as she healed, she taught Jake about the war that had been raging across the stars for longer than human civilization had existed, and the scale of it made his head spin. The Starborn elves had once ruled a peaceful empire spanning hundreds of worlds until the Devourers appeared from beyond the edge of known space and began consuming planet after planet, leaving nothing behind but dead rocks floating in the void. Lyria was not just a princess, but a battle commander who had led fleets against impossible odds and survived battles that killed thousands of her people, and she carried that weight in her eyes even when she smiled. She showed Jake how to hold the plasma rifle. She gave him and how to aim using not just his eyes but his mind, and at first he thought she was speaking in metaphors, but then he felt that resonance energy she had mentioned flowing through him into the weapon. The rifle hummed with power when he held it and responded to his thoughts faster than his trigger finger ever could, and when he fired it at a tree trunk for practice, the blast carved through the wood like it was paper. Ember watched his training sessions with interest. And one morning while Lyria was meditating, the dragon approached Jake on her own and pressed her warm scaled head against his chest, and he felt something click into place in his mind. Suddenly he could sense Ember emotions as clearly as if she was speaking them aloud, and he felt her curiosity about him and her affection for Lyria and her burning hatred for the Devourers who had hurt them. Both. Lyria came running when she felt what was happening and stared at Jake with wide eyes full of shock and wonder because she said, "This should not be possible for a human to bond with a dragon this quickly." Starborn trained for years to achieve what Jake had just done naturally, and she began to realize that humanity potential for resonance was far greater than anyone had suspected. And that made humans incredibly valuable in the war effort. But it also made them targets because the Devourers would want to eliminate humanity before they could become a threat. And that meant the enemy would come in force once they learned what humans could do. Jake spent hours each day practicing with Ember and learning to see through her eyes and feel what she felt, and the bond between them grew stronger until he could call her to his side with just a thought. The fourth morning, Lyria was teaching Jake advanced combat techniques when Ember suddenly raised her head and growled low in her throat, and every scale on her body stood on edge. Lyria grabbed her weapons and told Jake they had company, and he felt it too through his bond with Ember, because something wrong was approaching, something that felt like death. And DK3 figures emerged from the forest, and at first glance they looked almost human, but their movements were too smooth and their skin had a grayish tint that was not natural. They wore armor similar to Lyria, but corrupted and twisted, and when they spoke, their voices sounded like grinding metal, and they demanded that Lyria surrender immediately. She answered them in their own harsh language, and whatever she said made them angry because they raised weapons that looked like jagged crystals pulsing with dark energy. The battle happened faster than Jake could fully process, and Lyria moved like water flowing around attacks and striking back with precision that came from centuries of practice. Jake fired his plasma rifle at one of the scouts, and the blast caught it in the shoulder and spun it around, and it screamed in a voice that made his bones ache. Ember launched herself at another scout, and her claws ripped through its armor like foil, and her teeth closed on its neck, and there was a sickening crunch before it stopped moving. The third scout focused on Jake, because he was the weakest fighter, and it charged at him with speed that should not have been possible, but Jake had learned something in his days with Lyria did not try to match the scout's speed, but instead predicted where it would be and fired at that spot, and his shot caught it mid-leap, and it crashed to the ground smoking butt. Before it died, it pressed something on its armor, and a signal burst out into the sky, and Jake knew without being told that it had just called for help. Lyria killed the first scout with a blade that glowed blue-white, and then checked the others to make sure they were truly dead, and her face was grim. When she turned to Jake, the signal had gone out, and a Devourer warship would receive it and come to investigate, and they had maybe 2 days before it arrived, and when it did, the ship would destroy everything for miles around. Jake realized they could not hide anymore, and they could not run, because the NWHs would track them wherever they went, and the only option was to warn people and try to prepare some kind of defense. He pulled out his phone and made a call he never thought he would make again, because he had left that life behind, but now he needed help from someone who had the power to mobilize forces. Quickly, General Helen Carter answered on the third ring, and her voice was suspicious because Jake had not called her in 3 years, and when he told her he needed her to come to his location immediately, she heard something in his tone that made her agree. Did not tell her about aliens or dragons or wars between stars, because she would never believe that over the phone, but he used a code phrase from their military days that meant the situation was critical, and Rial, the general, arrived 12 hours later in a helicopter with a security team, and when she saw Lyria and Ember standing in front of Jake, cabin her hand went to her sidearm automatically. Jake stepped between them and told her to listen for 5 minutes before making any decisions, and something in his eyes made her nod and holster her weapon. Lyria told her story again and showed technology that proved she was not from Earth, and Ember demonstrated abilities that no Earth creature possessed, and slowly the general expression changed from skepticism to horror. She asked questions rapid-fire about Devourer capabilities and numbers and tactics, and Lyria answered each one honestly, even when the answers were terrifying. A single Devourer warship could level a city in minutes, and the ship coming would arrive with fighter craft and ground troops, and Earth had no defenses against weapons that could crack planets. General Carter stood silent for a long moment, processing everything she had learned, and then she made a decision that would change human history forever. She told Jake and Lyria to come with her to a secure military base where they could present this information to people who had the authority to act on a global scale. Jake gathered his things knowing he would probably never return to this cabin, and as he locked the door behind him, he felt both loss and purpose. Because his quiet life was truly over now, but when he looked at Lyria standing beside Ember in the afternoon sunlight and felt their bond with him through resonance, he knew this was where he was meant to be. Helicopter carried them south toward the base, and Jake watched the mountains fall away below and wondered if humanity was ready for what was coming. They landed at a facility that did not appear on any maps and were rushed into underground briefing rooms where military officers and government officials gathered to hear the impossible truth. Lyria stood before them and spoke with calm authority about the threat approaching. Earth and the war humanity was about to join, whether they wanted to or not. Some of the officials argued that this must be a trick or a hoax, but then Lyria demonstrated her technology, and Ember walked into the room, and all arguments stopped. Jake watched these powerful people struggle to accept a new reality, and saw fear and denial and anger pass across their faces before determination. Finally, one General Carter took command of the situation and began organizing responses and protocols, and Jake found himself assigned as liaison between military forces and Lyria because of his bond with her. And Ember scientists arrived to study the plasma rifle and Lyria armor, and they asked endless questions about resonance and dragon bonding and technologies that seemed like magic. Jake went trained with other soldiers and taught them what he had learned about resonance, and to his surprise, several of them showed the same potential he had. Lieutenant Amy Brooks was the strongest among them, and she formed a weak bond with Ember within hours of trying, and Lyria said this confirmed her theory about human abilities. Plans were made and resources mobilized, and humanity began preparing for its first interstellar war. With only days to get ready, Lyria revealed that she was not the only starborn survivor on Earth, because 3 others had crashed in different locations, and each one had a dragon companion. If they could find and unite these survivors, humanity would have more warriors and more dragons and a much better chance of survival. Jake volunteered to lead the retrieval mission for the nearest survivor, who was hiding somewhere in the Amazon rainforest, and General Carter approved the operation. Immediately, as Jake prepared to leave, Lyria pulled him aside and told him something she had not shared with the others because she was not sure how they would react. She said the bond between him and Ember was stronger than any bond she had seen in her 300 years of life, and that kind of connection was supposed to be impossible between different species. Jake did not fully understand what that meant, but he saw hope in Lyria's eyes, and he promised her he would bring back the other starborn warriors safely. The Amazon rainforest stretched endlessly below the transport plane, and Jake stared down at the green canopy, wondering how they were supposed to find one alien warrior hiding somewhere in millions of acres of jungle. Lyria sat beside him with her eyes closed and her hand pressed against a device that looked like a crystal wrapped in silver wire, and she said she could feel her fellow starborn presence like a distant heartbeat calling to her. The plane landed at a research station on the edge of the forest, and Jake team consisted of Lieutenant Amy Brooks and 4 other soldiers who had shown resonance potential during training. They moved into the jungle at dawn, following Lyria directions, and the heat and humidity hit them like a wall, but none of them complained because they knew what was at stake. Ember flew above the canopy, providing aerial reconnaissance through her bond with Jake, and he could see the forest from her perspective while also watching where he placed his feet on the ground. After 6 hours of hiking, they found signs that someone had been living in a cave system hidden behind a waterfall, and Lyria called out in her native language and waited. A figure emerged from the shadows, and Jake hand went to his rifle, but Lyria stopped him with a gesture, because this was who they had come to find. His name was Kale, and he was a starborn warrior who looked younger than Lyria, but moved with the same deadly grace, and his dragon shadow was massive compared to Ember, with scales like polished black stone. Kale was suspicious at first because he had been hunted since his crash and trusted no one, but Lyria convinced him that humanity was preparing to fight and needed his help. He agreed to come with them, but only after Jake proved he could hold his own in a sparring match, and Jake barely survived 30 seconds against the warrior's speed and skill. Shadow bonded with Amy Brooks almost immediately, and the dragon seemed to recognize her potential. The same way Ember had recognized Jake and Amy, gasped when the connection formed. Journey back to the base took 2 days because they had to move carefully and avoid being tracked by Devourer scouts who were still searching the area when they arrived. General Carter had news that made everyone's stomach sink because the Alstay Devourer warship had been detected by Earth's satellites and was approaching faster than expected. They had less than 24 hours before it entered orbit and the world. Governments had finally agreed to unite their forces, but coordination was chaos and nobody was truly ready. Emergency broadcasts went out to every country explaining that an alien threat was real and imminent, and people should take shelter in designated safe zones. Immediately, Jake watched the news coverage showing panic in cities around the world as millions of people tried to process the impossible truth and find safety for their families. Scientists had been working around the clock to understand starborne technology, and they had managed to retrofit some experimental aircraft with shield generators that might protect them from energy weapons. Lyria and Kale trained groups of soldiers in basic combat tactics against Devourer forces and emphasized that the enemy was strong but not invincible, and humans had advantages they could exploit. The resonance abilities that humans possessed meant they could potentially bond with any starborne weapons or technology and use them more effectively than the Devourers expected. Jake spent his last few hours before the battle checking equipment and talking quietly with Ember and feeling her determination and confidence through their bond. Amy found him in the hangar and sat beside him, and they did not speak for a while because words felt inadequate for what they were about to face. She finally said she never imagined her military service would lead to fighting actual aliens in space, but she was glad to be there with people she trusted. Told her about the cabin in the mountains where this all started and how Lyria had knocked on his door at midnight and changed everything. He said he had been running from his warrior nature for years, but now he understood that some people were meant to fight, and protecting others was not a burden but a purpose. The alarm sounded across the base, and everyone rushed to their stations because the Rivaro warship had entered orbit and was launching fighter craft toward Earth. Jake climbed into a modified fighter jet that had been equipped with starborne shields and weapons, and Ember flew alongside him, connected through their bond to Lyria. And Kale led their own squadrons, and General Carter coordinated from the command center, and every available military asset on Earth prepared to defend their planet. Devourer fighters descended like a swarm of metal insects, and they moved with unnatural precision, as if controlled by a single mind. Earth forces engaged them over the Pacific Ocean, and the sky lit up with explosions and energy blasts, and the battle was more intense than anything Jake had experienced in his military career. He followed his training and his instincts, and let resonance guide his movements and his shots. And he brought down 3 enemy fighters in the first 10 minutes. But for every enemy destroyed, 2 more seemed to appear, and Jake realized the Devourers were testing Earth defenses and learning their capabilities. Ember attacked fighters that got too close to Jake, and her fire breath melted through their armor, and her claws tore them apart, and together they were a devastating team. Lyria voice came through the communication system, telling all forces to focus fire on the warship weak points. She had identified and ignore the fighters for now. If they could damage the warship badly enough, it might retreat and give Earth time to prepare better defenses before the next attack. Jake broke away from the dogfight and flew toward the massive ship hanging in orbit like a dark moon, and its surface was covered in weapons and armor and pulsing energy shields. He targeted the shield generator. Lyria had marked and fired everything he had, and his weapons burned through the shields after several direct hits. Other fighters joined the assault, and the combined firepower finally breached the warship outer defenses and caused explosions to ripple across its hull. But the victory was brief because the ship began launching dropships toward Earth. Surface and Jake knew the battle was about to get much worse. General Carter reported that Devourer ground forces were landing in major cities and engaging. Military units and civilian casualties were already climbing into the thousands. Jake wanted to help defend the cities, but Lyria ordered him to stay focused on the warship because if they did not stop it, nothing else Woodmatter, Kale, and Shadow managed to penetrate the warship interior through a damaged section, and they planted explosives. Near the reactor, while fighting through corridors full of enemy soldiers, Jake provided cover fire from outside and kept enemy reinforcements away from the breach point, and every second felt like an hour as he waited for Kale to complete his mission. Warrior emerged just as the timer hit 0, and the reactor exploded with a blast that lit up space brighter than the sun for several seconds. Warship began breaking apart and falling toward Earth's atmosphere, and General Carter ordered all forces to shoot down the pieces before they could crash into populated areas. Jake fired until his weapons overheated and his arms ached in beside him. Ember breathed fire until she could barely stay airborne from exhaustion. The largest piece of the warship burned up in atmosphere, but smaller fragments crashed into the ocean in remote areas and caused tsunamis and earthquakes. In the ground, the Devourer forces suddenly became disorganized when their ship was destroyed and human forces pushed back. Hardin began winning battles in the cities. By nightfall, the enemy had been driven back or eliminated, and Earth had won its first battle against an interstellar threat, but the cost was devastating. Millions had died in the attacks. An entire city, districts were destroyed, and humanity had learned the brutal truth that they were no longer alone in the universe. Jake landed his fighter at the base and climbed out on shaking legs, and Ember collapsed beside him, breathing hard, and he felt her pain and exhaustion through their bondeleria. Found him, and her armor was scorched and torn, and blood ran from a cut above her eye, but she was smiling because they had survived. She told him the Devourers would come again in greater numbers, now that they knew Earth would fight, but humanity had proven they were worthy opponents. General Carter gathered everyone who could still stand and announced that the United Nations was forming a new organization called the Planetary Defense Initiative, would no longer be unprepared, and they would build weapons and ships and train soldiers, and when the enemy returned, humanity would be ready. Jake looked up at the stars and knew his life would never be quiet again, but he also knew he had found something more valuable than peace. He had found a purpose and allies worth fighting beside, and a bond with Ember that transcended species and made him stronger than he ever was. Alone, Illyria said she had to return to her people and report what happened, and request reinforcements because Earth could not stand alone against the full might of the Devourers. But before she left, she asked Jake to come with her and represent humanity in the councils of the Starborn and help forge an alliance that would save both their peoples. He agreed without hesitation, because he understood now that his journey had only just begun, and the war for Earth's survival would be fought both on the planet and across the stars. The warning came exactly 8 days after the first Devourer warship was destroyed, and this time Earth was not caught completely unprepared, but nobody felt ready for what the sensors were showing. A fleet of 5 massive warships had entered the solar system, and they were 3 times larger than the first ship, and accompanied by hundreds of fighter craft and transport vessels. Lead ship broadcast a message that every communication device on Earth received simultaneously, and the voice that spoke was cold and ancient, and promised nothing but death. The entity called itself the Render, and it had personally overseen the extinction of 20 different species, and Earth would be the 21st, unless humanity surrendered within 1 hour. General Carter's response was broadcast back into space in every language and frequency, and it consisted of exactly 3 words that made Jake proud to be human. Come and take it. The Devourer fleet accelerated toward Earth, and General Carter activated every defense plan they had developed in the past week and called every soldier to their battle stations. Jake stood in the hangar next to Ember, who was fully healed and eager to fight, and around them pilots were climbing into retrofitted fighters equipped with the best starborn technology. Earth scientists could replicate. Illyria had not yet left for her home world because her ship needed repairs, and Jake was grateful she would be fighting beside them one more time. Kale and Amy were paired together with Shadow, and they had become an effective team during training, and their bond had grown almost as strong as Jake's connection with Ember. The other 2 Starborn survivors had been located and brought to the base, and they were warriors named Vera and Thane, and their dragons Storm and Frost added much-needed power to Earth, for as the battle plan was desperate but simple, because Earth fighters would engage the enemy fleet in space, while ground forces protected the cities from dropship invasion. Scientists had activated the ancient shield generator that Lyria people had left buried under Antarctic ice thousands of years ago, and it now protected the entire planet with an energy barrier. The shields would not stop everything, but they would slow the Devourers down and force them to commit more resources to breaking through, and that would buy Earth valuable time. Jake took off with his squadron, and Ember flew beside his fighter, and through their bond he could feel her battle fury burning hot and ready to be unleashed. The space around Earth filled with ships and weapons, fire and explosions, and Jake had never seen anything like the scale of destruction happening in every direction. He targeted a Devourer fighter and felt resonance guide his aim, and his shot pierced its shields and tore through the hull, and the enemy craft exploded in a ball of fire. But 3 more fighters immediately moved to attack him, and he had to roll and dive and use every trick he knew to avoid their weapons, while Ember burned one of them out of the sky. Lyria. The voice came over the communication channel, giving orders and tactical updates, and her centuries of combat experience showed in how she positioned forces and exploited enemy weaknesses. The Devourer warships began firing massive energy beams at the planetary shield, and each impact sent ripples of light across the barrier, but it held firm against the assault. Jake's squadron was assigned to attack the shield generators on the warships to prevent them from protecting their hulls, and it meant flying directly into the enemy. Heaviest defenses, he lost a wingman in the first attack run and barely escaped himself when a blast clipped his fighter and sent him spinning. But Ember caught his wing with her claws and stabilized him. The sacrifice was not in vain, because their attack opened holes in the warship shields, and other squadrons poured fire through the gaps and damaged critical systems on Earth's surface. The first dropships broke through the planetary shield and landed in New York and Tokyo and London and dozens of other cities. Simultaneously, Devourer ground forces emerged from the dropships, and they were nightmares made real, with armor fused to their bodies and weapons that fired corruption and death. Human soldiers met them in the streets and fought building by building and block by block, and the casualties mounted on both sides. But humanity refused to break. Jake saw the city battles through tactical displays and wanted desperately to help, but Lyria insisted their focus had to remain on the warships, because that was where the battle would be won or lost. Kale Amy led a strike team toward the command ship where the render was located, and they managed to breach the hull and fight their way inside despite overwhelming resistance. Jake provided cover fire and kept enemy reinforcements away from the breach point, and Ember burned through anything that got too close to their position inside. The warship Kale and Amy planted charges on critical systems, while fighting through waves of enemy soldiers, and Shadow and Frost created paths of destruction. The render itself appeared to confront them, and it was a massive creature that looked like metal and corrupted flesh had been fused together into something that should not exist. It wielded weapons powered by dark energy that seemed to drain life from everything they touched, and its voice was like grinding metal when it spoke. Render said humanity was foolish to resist, and that the Devourers had consumed civilizations far older and stronger, and Earth would fall like all the others. Kale attacked with fury and skill, but the Render was faster and stronger, and it wounded him badly with a strike that sent him crashing into a wall. Amy tried to help, but Shadow was driven back by the creature energy weapons, and Frost was barely holding the line against enemy reinforcements. Through his bond with Ember, Jake felt the moment when Amy called out through resonance for help, and he did not hesitate before changing course and flying directly toward the warship. Lyria shouted for him to stay in position, but he ignored her because his friends needed him, and that was all that mattered. He crashed his damaged fighter through a window in the warship hull and ejected before impact, and Ember caught him in midair, and they flew through the corridors following Amy's psychic signal. They found the battle in a massive chamber where the Render stood over Kale's broken body and was about to deliver the killing blow. Jake fired his plasma rifle, and the blast hit the Render in the back and made it turn toward him with eyes that burned with ancient hatred. Ember attacked from the other side, and her claws raked across the creature armor, and her fire breath washed over its body, but it seemed barely affected. Render moved faster than anything that Sci should be able to, and it grabbed Ember by the throat and slammed her into the floor hard enough to crack the metal. Jake felt her pain through their bond, and rage flooded through him hotter than any fire in resonance. Energy surged through his body in a way it never had before. He channeled everything he had into his weapon and fired a blast that was 10 times more powerful than anything the rifle was. Designed to produce, the shot hit the render in the chest and burned through its armor, and the creature screamed in a voice that made the entire ship shake. Illyria appeared in the doorway with Vera and Thane and their dragons, and together they pressed the attack. While the render was wounded and off-balance, Theth combined assault finally brought the creature down, and Illyria drove her glowing blade through its core, and the render died with a final curse, promising that more would come. Helped Kale to his feet, and he was badly hurt but alive, and Shadow and Frost guarded the exit while they set the charges to overload the warship reactor. They had minutes to escape before the explosion, and Jake carried Kale while Ember flew beside them, and they ran through corridors as alarms blared and fires spread. Warship began tearing itself apart as they reached the breach point, and they jumped into space. Just as the reactor exploded and the blast wave caught them and sent them tumbling, Jake felt Ember grab him and fold her wings around his body to protect him, and the heat and pressure were intense, but they
survived the command ship destruction.
Caused chaos in the Devourer fleet, and 2 other warships collided trying to retreat and exploded in massive fireballs. Remaining ships fled the solar system, and Earth forces did not pursue because they were too damaged and exhausted to press the advantage on the ground. The Devourer forces suddenly became disorganized when their command structure collapsed, and human soldiers overwhelmed them in every city. By the time the sun rose, the enemy had been completely defeated, and Earth had won a victory that would be remembered for generations, but the cost was devastating because millions had died and entire cities were in ruins, and the world would need years to rebuild. Jake landed at the base with Ember, and they both collapsed from exhaustion and pain, and medics rushed to help them and treat their injurious. Loria found him in the medical bay and sat beside his bed and told him he had been incredibly brave and foolish in equal measure, and she was glad he survived. She said the resonance power he had channeled would have killed most people, but somehow he had survived it, and that confirmed her belief that humans were special. Kale recovered from his wounds thanks to starborn medicine, and he told Jake that few warriors in any species would have done what he did, and humanity should be proud. General Carter gathered all the survivors and announced that Earth had proven itself worthy of joining the galactic community, and the Starborn had agreed to form a formal alliance. The Planetary Defense Initiative would become humanity gateway to the stars, and they would build ships and stations and train soldiers to fight alongside the Starborn. The days after the battle were filled with grief and rebuilding, and humanity slowly came to terms with the new reality that they were no longer alone in the universe. Memorial services were held in every country for those who had died defending Earth, and their names were carved into monuments that would stand for centuries. Jake attended as many ceremonies as his duties allowed, and each one reminded him why they had fought, why they would keep fighting no matter what came next. Ember remained close to him always, and her presence through their bond was a constant comfort and source of strength when the weight of everything threatened to overwhelm him. The Antarctic shield generator continued to protect Earth, and scientists worked to understand the technology so they could build more and expand the defenses beyond the planet. Illyria spent weeks helping human engineers and researchers and sharing knowledge that the Starborn had accumulated over thousands of years of spacefaring civilization. She said humanity reminded her of her own people in their early days when they were young and fierce and determined to survive against impossible odds. The Starborn High Council had sent word that they were impressed by Earth's resistance and wanted to formalize an alliance that would benefit both civilizations. Jake was preparing to travel to their homeworld to negotiate the terms and represent humanity interests, and the responsibility felt enormous, but he was ready. Me and several other soldiers who had shown strong resonance abilities were selected to go with him and form the core of humanity. First official Dragon Rider, Corskale, and the other Starborn warriors chose to remain on Earth to continue training human forces. Because they believed this planet would be crucial in the larger war, General Carter was promoted to lead the planetary defense initiative, and given resources that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago, the nations that had been enemies for decades were now working together because the Devourer threat made all human conflicts seem trivial by comparison. Jake walked through the rebuilt sections of the base and saw soldiers training with starborn weapons and pilots practicing maneuvers in retrofitted fighters. The transformation was remarkable, and humanity was adapting to their new role faster than anyone had predicted. Vera told him that humans had something most other species lost over time, and when he asked what that was, she said it was hope. Combined with stubbornness, she explained that ancient civilizations became cautious and afraid of loss, but humans were too young to know they should be afraid, and that made them dangerous. Allies. Jake thought about his cabin in the mountains and wondered if he would ever return there, or if that peaceful life was gone forever. But when he felt Ember presence in his mind and saw the preparations happening all around him, he realized peace was something worth fighting for, not hiding from. The Starborn ship arrived in orbit 3 weeks after the battle, and it was beautiful in a way that human ships could never match, with elegant curves and flowing designs. Jake and his team boarded a shuttle, flew up to meet it, and as they approached, he felt excitement and nervousness warring in his chest. Lyria met them at the airlock and guided them through corridors that seemed to be made of living crystal that pulsed with soft light. The ship interior was vast and filled with technology that looked more like art than machinery, and Jake understood why the Starborn had survived for so long. They were not just warriors, but builders and dreamers who valued beauty as much as function. Ember and the other dragons were given special quarters designed for their comfort, and they seemed happy to be in a space that was made with their needs in mind. The journey to the Starborn homeworld would take 2 weeks, even with faster-than-light travel, and Jake used the time to learn everything he could about their culture. Lyria taught him their language and customs and history, and he was amazed by the depth of their civilization and everything they had accomplished. She told him about the worlds they had saved and the species they had helped, and the art and music and literature they had created across millennia, but she also showed him the scars they carried from the war with the Devourers and the losses that still haunted them. Despite their strength, Jake realized the Starborn were not invincible gods, but people who had been fighting so long they had almost forgotten what peace felt like. He told Lyria that humanity could help remind them, because humans were good at finding joy even in the darkest times, and that was a gift worth sharing. She smiled at him in a way that made his heart skip, and said that was exactly why the alliance between their peoples was so important. The Starborn homeworld appeared ahead of them, and it was more beautiful than anything Jake had imagined, with floating cities and vast forests and oceans that shimmered with bioluminescent life. They landed in the capital and were greeted by crowds of Starborn who had heard about humanity courage and wanted to see the warriors who had defeated the Renda. Jake felt overwhelmed by the attention, but Ember walked beside him radiating confidence and pride, and that helped him. Stantal, the High Council, met with them in a chamber carved from a single massive crystal, and the council members were ancient and wise, and their eyes held the weight of centuries. Jake spoke on behalf of humanity and explained what Earth needed to defend itself and what they could offer in return to the Alliance. He talked about human innovation and adaptability and the resonance abilities that made them uniquely suited to bond with dragons and use Starborn technology. Council was impressed but cautious, because they had seen many young species fail when given too much power too quickly. Jake argued that humanity had already proven themselves in battle, and that the Devourers would not wait for Earth to be ready, so preparation had to happen. Now, after hours of discussion, the Council agreed to provide ships and weapons and training, but they also asked for human soldiers to serve in Starborn fleets. The war was vast, and the Starborn were stretched thin across multiple fronts, and Earth forces would make a real difference if they were willing to fight beyond their own world. Jake accepted the terms, knowing that many humans would volunteer because they understood the threat was not just to Earth, but to all free civilizations. Alliance was formally signed, and celebrations erupted across the Starborn homeworld because new allies were rare and precious in the long war. That night, Jake stood on a balcony overlooking the city, and Lyria joined him, and they watched the lights dance in the sky from fireworks and energy displays. She thanked him again for answering his door at midnight and trusting her when he had every reason not to. Jake told her he was glad she knocked because she had given him purpose and adventure, and a bond with. Ember that was more valuable than anything else Illyria, said the bond between. Him and Ember was special even by Starborn standards. It might be the key to understanding why humans had such strong resonance. She believed that humanity was meant to join this war, and that fate or destiny or whatever force guided the universe had brought them together at exactly the right time. Jake did not know if he believed in destiny, but he knew he would fight to protect both Earth and the Starborn, because they were allies now, and allies stood together. The next morning, training began for the human soldiers who would serve in Starborn fleets, and they threw themselves into learning with the same determination that had saved Earth Army, bonded even more deeply with Shadow, and became one of the most skilled riders in the entire Alliance. Despite having only months of experience, Jake was given command of a mixed human Starborn squadron, and they began running missions against Devourer outposts and nearby systems. Each battle taught them more about working together and combining their different strengths, and they won victories that neither species could have achieved. Alone, months passed, and Earth continued to transform. New technologies were integrated, and defenses were strengthened, and humanity reached out toward the stars. The Planetary Defense Initiative launched the first human-built warships designed with Starborn assistance, and they were powerful enough to make the enemy take notice. Jake returned to Earth briefly and visited the memorial sites and spoke with families who had lost loved ones and promised them the sacrifices had not been in vain. Also made a trip to his old cabin in the mountains and found it exactly as he had left it. But it felt like a place from another lifetime. Standing on the porch where Lyria had first knocked, he realized that moment had changed everything. Not just for him, but for all of humanity. Ember landed beside him and pressed her head against his shoulder, and he felt her understanding through their bond. Because she had been there too, they flew back to the base together, and Jake looked down at the world below and saw cities rebuilding and people working together and hope burning bright. The war with the Devourers was far from over, and many battles still lay ahead, but humanity was no longer facing them alone. Jake had opened his door to a stranger in a storm, and that simple act of kindness had forged an alliance between worlds and given both civilizations a fighting chance. As he prepared for his next mission, he thought about the future and knew it would be filled with danger and sacrifice, but also wonder and discovery. The age of isolation was over, and humanity had taken its place among the stars, not as conquerors, but as defenders of all life against those who would destroy it. Lyria found him before launch, gave him a gift that was a small crystal that would let them communicate across any distance using resonance.